Ancient civilizations. They utilised the materials available to them. Wood, metal, fire and stone to make some pretty creative weapons. But as simple as these weapons might seem by today's standards, don't fool yourself. Some ancient weapons were extremely lethal. Let's take a look at the top 5 most effective ancient weapons.
Number 5.
Warhammers originated in Europe and the Middle East and were used by both cavalry and foot soldiers. The design featured a head and a handle, and they were varied in length from 5 to 6 feet. The longer versions were meant to be used by foot soldiers, while the shorter ones were primarily used by soldiers on horseback. Warhammers were sometimes used to topple a horse-mounted soldier by striking at the horse's legs. They could strike helmets and cause concussions, and later versions of this weapon included a spike on one side of the hammerhead. The spike was used to disarm an enemy shield or the reins of a horse. The flat side of the hammer was used to dent armour, while the spike part could pierce it. Basically, the weapon was used to first knock down the enemy with the blunt side of the hammer and then to pierce the enemy with the sharp side. There were many different types of warhammers, including the maul, which had a long-handled hammer and looks a lot like a modern sledgehammer. There was the lucerne hammer, which featured a 3 to 4 pronged head with a very long pick, and the Bechtel corbett, also known as a horseman's pick, which featured a shorter spike and hammer with a blunt face.
Number 4.
Axes. They've been around for a long time and are an effective tool for a wide assortment of things. But where utility axes are used for things like chopping wood, battle axes had one sole purpose: to kill. Battle axes were an extremely effective ancient weapon because they were far cheaper to make than swords, they were highly versatile, and they were still very lethal. Battle axes differed a lot from utility axes, mainly in their weight. Battle axes were much lighter than splitting axes because they were made to slice through legs and arms, as opposed to heavy materials like wood. These battle axes were very popular with the Vikings, and they came in a wide variety. Some could be wielded with one hand, while some required both hands to wield. They could also be thrown at an enemy. The blades were made of carbon steel or forged steel, and the Viking battle axe was light and easy to maneuver. This gave Viking warriors an advantage over their enemies because they could quickly slice through an arm or a leg. Battle axes were a highly effective weapon that surely struck terror in the hearts of anyone unlucky enough to be on the receiving end of its vicious strike.
Number 3.
The mace was used for close combat and featured a handle with a menacing spiked head. The mace was not meant to draw blood like other types of weapons, but was rather designed for bruising and clubbing an enemy. The head could be made of copper, bronze, iron, steel or stone, and the handle was most commonly made of metal or wood. The head of the mace came in many forms, and they were really popular with peasant rebels and conscripted armies because they were cheap and easy to make. The fact that they were not designed to draw blood also provided a loophole for the clergy religious men, as they were not allowed to draw blood. So by using a mace they could still fight and not break any religious laws. The mace also evolved from the Upper Paleolithic club with the addition of a more elaborate head. The earliest types of maces were knob-flange maces which were capable of penetrating armour. Although earlier versions of the mace used a stone head, they were effective. The mace became the most effective when they began making the head out of metal because the stone often broke. Maces could deliver a pretty good blow, and foot soldiers tended to use shorter maces around 2 to 3 feet long, while cavalrymen used longer ones so they could strike their opponents from horseback.
Number 2.
The bow and arrow is an effective ancient weapon in and of itself, but when you light the arrow on fire, you have one of the most effective weapons in history. The origins of arrowheads date back to around 61,000 years ago, so they're a prehistoric weapon. The bow and arrow was used throughout ancient and medieval times, and they were used as military weapons as well as for hunting. Their significance in both cannot be overlooked, but when fire was added to the arrow, it became an even more formidable force. Flaming arrows were used in both ancient and medieval times, and the earliest types of these flaming arrows had tips soaked in resin or oil. They were tied below the arrowhead and were used to set wooden structures ablaze. From there, the Romans created more sophisticated types of flaming arrows. They attached iron boxes and or tubes full of incendiary substances to the arrows. The arrows though could only be shot from loose bows because if the arrows went too fast the flames would go out. This was problematic because it meant that the shooter had to get pretty close to the target, and by the time he did, the flame often went out before it hit, so another type of flaming arrow was invented. This time, the arrow featured a curved metal bar which was like a small cage. The cage was stuffed full of hot coals and attached to the arrow. This way the arrow could be shot from a further distance without the fire going out. These arrows were especially effective in setting things ablaze from a much safer distance. As you can imagine, flaming arrows were a great way to penetrate a city under siege, since the arrows could breach the walls and set things on fire. Flaming arrows are often used interchangeably with fire arrows, but they're not the same thing. Fire arrows were used as early as the 9th century, and they were the first form of weaponized gunpowder that featured a pouch of gunpowder attached to an arrow. Fire arrows were used in China and paved the way for the fire lancers, which are the very first firearms. Fire arrows had a much larger range because they were propelled by gunpowder, and they can travel as far as 1,000 feet.
Number 1.
One of the most simple and effective weapons was the spear. A spear is simply a shaft with a pointed head. It's a type of pole weapon, but its roots run deep. The earliest evidence of spears points to over 400,000 years ago, and spears are one of the earliest weapons in human history. It's believed that Neanderthals made stone spear heads, and evidence of wooden spears with fire-hardened points date back to almost 250,000 years ago. Ancient civilizations like the Greeks, Romans, and Egyptians all used spears in combat. Eventually, shields were added to the mix, and a basic shield and spear called a pilum became the standard weapon of the Roman army from the 2nd century BC to the 4th. When the Western Roman Empire fell, spears continued to be used across Europe. Some spears were designed for close combat, while others were designed to be thrown. As such, spears came in a wide assortment of lengths, styles, and design, but at the base was always the same, a shaft with some sort of spearhead attached. The fact that spears were literally used for hundreds of thousands of years speaks to just how effective this seemingly simple weapon truly was. Although there were ancient weapons that look far more menacing and can inflict more damage than a simple spear, the spear is inarguably one of the most widely used weapons throughout ancient history. This is why the mighty spear stabbed its way into the top spot on this list.
Check out one of our other amazing videos.